The American Revolutionary War, or the American War for Independence, was a historic and fascinating conflict from 1775 to 1783. In it, the 13 colonies formerly governed by Britain decided to rise up against what they perceived as injustices by the British government against them and gained their independence through tremendous upsets in this conflict. In this video, we'll be looking at 7 battles and the Treaty of Paris. For the battles, I'll tell you the events of the battle, how it shaped the eventual course of the war, and then I'll show you some artwork depicting what the terrains and conditions might be like during that conflict. For the Treaty of Paris, we'll look into what the aftermath of the Revolutionary War meant for the colonies in America and for the British Empire. While this video is not going to cover every single conflict that occurred in the Revolutionary War, we are going to deal with the major ones that changed the course of the battle in some way, and the Treaty of Paris should give you some idea of the aftermath of the battle and how America was sort of founded and given its legitimacy. The first battle we're going to talk about is actually the first military engagement of the war. That is, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. This battle was fought on April 19, 1775, in Middlesex County in Massachusetts. The conflict started because Patriot forces were acquiring weapons and training for possible action. Now, of course, the British Army would have none of this, and Francis Smith was given an assignment to destroy the military supplies held by them in Middlesex County. Now, of course, the American forces were not going to accept this peaceably, and it escalated into the first conflict of the war. Surprisingly, this ended in a British defeat when they were driven back to Boston. This is largely attributed to their underestimation of the strength of the American forces. This battle was important in the American Revolution primarily because it was the first. It escalated the conflict from adversarial feelings to full-on conflict. The art I have selected for the Battle of Lexington and Concord is a view of the south part of Lexington during the battle in 1775 by the artist Amos Doolittle. You can see in this painting how organized the British regulars were compared to the chaos of the American forces. However, they would still suffer defeat as they underestimated the rallying and attacking ability of the American forces. You can also see the nature of the battle as it was largely fought around small farming towns in the area. The next battle we'll be discussing is the Battle of Bunker Hill. This was fought in June 1775 in the town of Charleston in Massachusetts. This occurred during the Siege of Boston by the British. They attempted to gain control of the harbor as well as taking charge of the outposts on the nearby hill. They are confronted by American forces on Bunker Hill and suffer immense casualties but still manage to take the hill. This is seen as a somewhat bittersweet victory for the British, as their losses were immense even though they still did manage to take the hill, and it did show some of the capabilities of the American army. This battle was influential in the war, namely because of the sheer shock on the British side from the losses they suffered in attempts to take the hill, once again proving that they maybe underestimated the American forces' capability. The artwork I have chosen for this battle is the painting of Bunker Hill by Howard Pyle. You can see the British march up in neat files up the steep hill while their fellow soldiers lay dead above them. It truly shows the horrifying terrain of the battle and the grotesque losses that the British Army faced while attempting to take this hill. The third battle we will be discussing is the Battle of Sullivan's Island, also known as the Battle of Fort Sullivan, fought on June 28, 1776. It took place in Charleston, South Carolina. This battle was a direct result of a massive siege of the city of Charleston by more than 3,000 British soldiers. General Charles Lee was in charge of the defense of Charleston, and his defense was successful. It greatly increased the support for the revolutionaries among the southern colonies, in addition to driving the British out of their position there. Incredibly, the success of the defense of Charleston may not have been due to General Charles Lee's leadership, which is actually relatively poor, but it may have been due to some of the construction of the fort at Charleston. It was constructed out of palmetto logs, which are especially resistant to cannon fire because of their spongy material. Cannonballs would just bounce off them, and thus naval bombardment of the fort there was unsuccessful. This battle was incredibly consequential for the American Revolution, both geopolitically and strategically. In addition to the British being driven out of their position in the southern colonies, it also increased the support for the American side of things, which allowed Americans to keep their hold in the southern colonies while British tried to sway a pin into the Loyalists. This was incredibly important for the Americans as they had to hold that southern stronghold during the rest of the war. The artwork I have selected for this battle is an image of Sergeant Jasper raising the Revolutionary battle flag over the still standing fort. It was painted by Johannes Ortel. The next battle we will be discussing is a very major battle in the Revolutionary War, that is, the Battle of Trenton. It was fought in December 1776 in New Jersey. The British before this point were on an unexpected warpath throughout New York and New Jersey, crushing Patriot forces in deafening victories. However, they were routed unexpectedly at Trenton. This is a very surprise victory for the Patriot forces and did wonders for the revolutionaries' morale at the time. It even renewed trust in General Washington, which would be important later on in the war. This small but incredibly significant battle in the early stages of the war turned out to spark an incredible momentum that helped carry the revolutionaries to victory. For the specifics of this battle, we have to start at the morning of December 26. George Washington crossed the Delaware with his troops in a historic move the previous night. He was aiming to attack Hessian forces that were resting there at the town of Trenton. The Hessians had not been expecting this attack due to both armies being quartered for the winter and Washington's troops being at an all-time low for morale during this point in the war. However, Washington managed to rally them for one last attack and carried them across the Delaware with 2,400 men in boats. They surrounded the Hessian forces and took 2/3 of them in a surprise victory. The consequences of this battle were immense. While it may not have meant much for the British forces due to the Hessians being somewhat of an auxiliary unit, it did wonders for the morale across the United States with patriots and sympathizers. This allowed Washington to bring back his army from the verge of collapse and keep fighting in the Revolutionary War. The artwork I've selected for this battle is the iconic painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware, painted by Emmanuel Yates. We can see Washington's somewhat embellished determination during this painting, and we can also see the conditions of the icy river that would have made it difficult to make this crossing, which all demonstrates the heroic nature of this conflict. For our next battle, we move forward almost an entire year to September through October 1777. We are of course talking about the battles of Saratoga in New York. General Burgoyne attempts a military maneuver to meet with forces and assimilate with them in order to grow his strength and continue routing Washington. He is surrounded before he is able to meet these forces and defeated in a number of engagements around the town of Stillwater in New York. This is a decisive victory to the Americans, and it gives France the heads up to enter the war, as America has demonstrated its ability to win the conflict, giving France the confidence it needs to enter. France entering the war would turn out to be a pivotal point in the conflict. This battle is consequential for two reasons. Firstly, General Burgoyne's failed military exercise puts him in a dangerous position in his theater. He is no longer able to assimilate with those forces he previously thought he would be able to be, and it diminishes the size of his army. Battles in the American Revolutionary War were often guided by the principle of not losing your army. General Burgoyne failed to live up to this principle in the battles of Saratoga. Secondly, the battles of Saratoga prompted France to enter the war, as America had demonstrated it was capable of winning over England in this conflict. This would give America much more military power from France in addition to naval capabilities supplied by them. The artwork I have depicted for this battle is John Trumbull's rendition of the surrender of General Burgoyne. While it may not depict much relating to weather conditions or terrains during the battle, it provides a look into one of the most crucial actions in the war, that is the surrender of the general himself. This action signals somewhat of a turning point, as it would foreshadow France entering the war and more generals surrendering as Britain ends up losing its military hold in the American colonies. We now move on from heroic victories for the Patriot forces to a humiliating defeat. We are talking, of course, of the Siege of Charleston. This happened from March 29th to May 12th in the city of Charleston in 1780. The British had turned to the southern colonies as a route for their victory after the failure of Burgoyne's campaigns and his eventual surrender. They acted on their intuition that there was a strong loyalist sentiment in the southern colonies. Doing this, they put Charleston in their sights as a major city to capture. 6 weeks of grueling siege later, the American forces are unfortunately pressed into surrender. It is a humiliating defeat for the Patriot forces, and it extended the fighting in the colonies as the British were able to gain a foothold in that territory. The artwork I've chosen for this battle is a depiction of the Siege of Charleston in 1780 by Alonzo Chappell. It depicts the terrain and the type of artillery that the British used to surround the city and fire on it, and it gives you a good idea of what the conditions at the time of the siege were like. We now move on to our seventh and last major battle we will be discussing from the American Revolutionary War. We are of course talking about the final battle of the war, the Battle of Yorktown, fought in October 1781 in the town of Yorktown. This was the decisive engagement at the end of the Revolutionary War. It marked the surrender of Cornwallis's army and the end of major British engagements in the American theater. While smaller engagements still may have occurred in other territories, this marked the end of a British desire to continue fighting in the American peninsula, and with the surrender of Cornwallis and his army, peace talks somewhat officially started. The artwork I have depicted for this battle is another drawn Trumbull painting, this time depicting the surrender of Lord Cornwallis. It shows the British meeting on the left side of the field and the American on the right, with the general in between, providing a powerful image to the end of the American Revolutionary War, in a moment many would describe as the world turned upside down. With Yorktown, we of course move out of British engagements in the Revolutionary War and into peace talks. That is, of course, the Treaty of Paris, which was signed September 3, 1783. After Britain withdraws from conflict, the American Revolutionary War is finally completed with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. This treaty acknowledges the sovereignty of the United States and its borders, fishing, and trade rights. It also deals with the land seized from the Loyalists during the war and provides room for prisoner of war negotiations. With all this, conflict draws to the close, and Britain officially recognizes the United States as a sovereign entity. The famous and somewhat ironic artwork I have chosen for this event is the painting Treaty of Paris by Benjamin West. It depicts the American founders on the left side of the painting, but a blank space on the right side of the canvas, as the British had no intention to be included into this painting. It provides you somewhat of an insight into the humiliating nature of the British defeat during this war, because it seems so unlikely for such a massive force to be routed at the time. With this event, we reach the end of the American Revolutionary War and the end of the list of events that I have to describe to you today. While this may not comprise an exhaustive retelling of all the battles during the American Revolutionary War, I hope that these important battles may give you somewhat of an idea of the nature of this war and the unlikely success that our founding fathers had. Thank you.